All right, let's get this ball rolling. This is Professor Tatum here with yet another lecture for History 1302. Here we will be looking at the Great War, which is another name for World War One. Because during the time this was happening, nobody, and I mean nobody, wanted to do this again. So people weren't sitting around saying, "Hey, this sure is fun. Let's go do this again in a few years. We'll call that one World War Two, and we'll go ahead and call this one World War One to be preemptive." No, they called it the Great War because it was so vast and got so many countries involved in different ways. All right. So you hear me use those terms interchangeably throughout this lecture, but I'm talking about the same conflict. All right, a lot going on here. As usual, we'll look at a bit of context. Then we'll look at some characteristics of this war, see why it was a devastating war, as well as how it was the first real modern war in many ways. Then we'll look at some things that started getting the U.S. drifting toward getting into this war. Then we'll examine the U.S.'s role in the war, and then we'll look at what the war looks like here in the U.S., what was going on here as the war was being fought. And then we'll look at the end of the war, primarily President Wilson's plans to help negotiate the end of the war and what he was hoping to get out of being present at those peace talks. Now, this is a very significant topic that often gets not quite enough credit in its place in historical memory. So, all kinds of things I want us to realize happened as a result of this war. And these aren't things you need to write down or anything. I just want you to understand the gravity of this conflict. So, this inspired, in many ways, the Bolshevik Revolution, which would lead to the rise of the Soviet Union, which had all kinds of impacts on world history, as we'll see moving forward. This is also going to lead to the influenza pandemic, which will spread around the world, killing 2 million people more or less. And then this will also lead to the collapse of multiple empires, such as the Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, the traditional Russian Tsar Empire, and the German Empire. This will also severely damage Europe economically, and leave the U.S. as the major creditor to those European nations. We'll see what results from that in a future lecture. This will also lead to the rise of fascism and authoritarianism in Europe and Japan. And by that standard, this will directly feed into World War II, as well as the Holocaust and the Great Depression. And this will also inspire all kinds of anti colonial revolts throughout the Middle East and Southeast Asia. A lot of the issues going on in the Middle East as a result of this war are things that still have impacts into the present day. So this is definitely a very relevant conflict. And while I think you probably realized by now I'm not much of a military historian, I don't like breaking down battles and looking at tactics and things like that. I do want us to kind of examine the true characteristics of this war and try to understand its relevance in American history. So what really started this war out, put simply, was imperialism. Okay, I had a great mentor who would frequently say World War I was a king's war. So what happened here is, as European nations were colonizing in places like Africa and Asia, they kept kind of bumping into each other, having little skirmishes here and there, little territorial conflicts. And as these nations kept bumping into each other and having conflicts over territory, there was some serious tension building between some of these different nations. So their solution was to form military alliances. So this is kind of like somebody tells me they're going to beat me up after class, and I know I can't take them all by myself. I'm going to go round up a few of y'all and say, hey guys, I need y'all to come back me up after class. And if anybody else threatens to beat you up after class, you know that in that situation, I've got your back as long as you got mine now. We don't necessarily have to like each other 100%. We don't have to agree on everything, but I think we can at least agree to stand up for each other and defend each other from anybody who threatens to kick our butts after class. So if they mess with one of us, they got to mess with all of us. That's kind of how these military alliances worked. Different nations would form alliances together, basically just stating that if anyone declared war on one of those nations, all of the nations would combine their forces to retaliate. And that kind of gave an incentive for other nations to not mess with certain nations because they knew they were backed up by these alliances. There were two major alliances that formed that I want us to be aware of. One is the Central Powers. This included Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. There were other nations involved, but those were the key players of the Central Powers. Then there was the Allied Powers. This included Great Britain, France, and Russia as the key players there. Again, other countries involved. Those are just the big dogs. But the major rivalry driving the conflict between these two alliances was really between Great Britain, who had traditionally been this very powerful empire in Europe, and Germany, who was kind of looked at as the new kid on the block, starting to stake a claim and become somewhat powerful. Right, so they really kind of had this big competition there between old blood and new blood, driving this rivalry between these two alliances. And the final straw was the assassination of this guy here, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife. They were the heirs to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Therefore, they were aligned with the Central Powers. And there's all kinds of factors at play we need to understand with these imperial contests, the alliance system, etc., that could be viewed as causes of World War One. I don't dispute that. I'm never one to say there's a single cause and effect to anything. But the central spark that seemed to really set the ball in motion here was this assassination. So to really understand the cause of this assassination, we need to take a look here at the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We can see that it's comprised of several different nations. There were several different cultures and language groups here in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And we also need to understand that there were some people here in this nation of Serbia, just southeast here of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who wanted to get this nation here, Bosnia, to join with Serbia, right? They wanted them to break away from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and join with Serbia. And the assassin who came and killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand was part of an organization called the Black Hand, who were key advocates of this idea of having Bosnia break from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and join Serbia. Since this individual was linked to this organization that pushed for Bosnia to join with Serbia and break from the empire here, the Austro-Hungarians kind of assumed that Serbia must have backed up the assassin and sent him in to do what he did. But as it turns out, the Serbian government had no role in this whatsoever, right? That's kind of as if, say, for example, a member of a Mexican drug cartel came and killed a U.S. politician. And then the U.S. said, well, we need to go declare war on the Mexican government now. Doesn't really add up, but that's what happened here, all right? In response to this assassination, the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia, right? So that's one major Central Power nation declaring war on a nation linked to the Allied powers. And in response, each country's allies began declaring war on one another, right? There's a lot of tit for tat. Okay, you declared war on my ally, I'm going to declare war on you. Oh, yeah? Well, then I'm going to go and declare war on your ally. Oh, you declared war on my ally? Now I'm declaring war on you, and on it went. And until by 1914, the majority of Europe was at war, all right? And that's how we got this Great War, or World War One, started. And the U.S. originally tried to stay out of all of this, right? They said, what is this? This is not our problem. This assassination happened at some town called Sarajevo. I don't even know what that is, how to spell it. Who the hell is Granvilo Princip, the assassin? I don't know that guy. Who is the Archduke Franz Ferdinand? None of this has anything to do with us, all right? So the U.S. largely stayed out of this conflict. President Woodrow Wilson referred to this as a war with which we will have nothing to do, whose causes cannot touch us. And he even stated that future generations will see the United States as blessed among nations for staying out of the war. Who's going to be the one to break it to him? He even got himself reelected eventually on a campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war." All right, so let's take a look at why the U.S. would really want to stay out of this war, right? This will also help us understand the modern nature of this war. So we can see there's all kinds of new technologies and weaponry in this war, some of which were being used for the first time, some of them being used more extensively than they ever had, and most of them more advanced than anyone had ever seen up to this point in time. For example, this was the first war to use airplanes. They'd be used for what were called dogfights. You can see there's a machine gun hooked up to this plane here, and pilots would fly real close to each other, and there would be machine gun fights between these airplanes that would shoot each other down. This here is the Red Baron. This was a popular fighter pilot plane during World War One. If you've ever seen Peanuts, you've probably seen Snoopy up in his doghouse pretending like he's fighting this guy here. But there were also tanks. They had these little pea shooter cannons here. That does not look nearly as intimidating as later tanks, but still, this is something who could come and roll in, crush things, and shoot missiles out of this little cannon here. Definitely going to lead to more devastating warfare than had ever been seen up to this point. Submarines, also known as U-boats at this time, had been used to some extent in earlier conflicts. but they were used much more extensively now because they were much more advanced, and they were much more effective by the start of World War One for doing things like attacking enemy ships in secret and sinking them. Hold that thought. That's going to be pretty important moving forward here. Flamethrowers also common in this war. It's sim flames shooting out, scorching the earth, and burning up anyone and anything in sight. Poison gas, first extensively used in this conflict, much more extreme than ever before. Machine guns had already been invented by this point, had already been used somewhat in combat. They had been significantly developed and were much more deadly than ever before, and extensively used in this war as well. All right, in addition to all these new innovations in technology that made this war more deadly, we also need to consider the mode of conflict, which was most common on the Western Front, which is where the war was fought in France, Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, over in Western Europe. Okay, this type of conflict had been used before. It was common, for example, in the U.S. Civil War. So this is exactly what it sounds like. It's warfare fought from trenches. People would quite literally dig themselves down into these very extensive trenches, and they'd line up in here. We'd have this land up here called No Man's Land, and on the other side of No Man's Land, the enemies would be dug down into their own trenches, and the two sides would come up to the top every now and then and fire back and forth at each other. And then once in a blue moon, one side would get ballsy and charge up through No Man's Land, and everybody would usually get gunned down or gassed. Very, very devastating type of warfare, right? Not much progress was really made through this, but there were a whole lot of deaths back and forth. You can see here, this does not look like a good place to be. It looks like some people have already fallen in combat. There's also all kinds of lice, rats, critters running around in here. And there's also a great deal of disease spread because look, one thing I don't see in here anywhere is somewhere to go if you need to go. You know what I mean? One time when I was teaching this, I had a student who had been in the service. He said, sure, they've got helmets. That's where they go. And he wasn't far off, right? They pretty much had to go wherever they can and hope they have a way of burying it. And you can only imagine what kind of disease spread things like that would lead to. This was a very costly, deadly, devastating war. All right. We saw somewhere around 9.7 million military deaths, somewhere around 10 million civilian deaths. We got to put this into perspective, right? I never cared that we know specific numbers, but number one, we can see those are huge freaking numbers. Number two, if we put this into perspective, this means that some European countries lost nearly entire generations of young men. Sink in. This was a brutal, devastating conflict. I can definitely see why the U.S. would want to try to stay out of this if possible. There were some factors, however, that did wind up leading the U.S. to start drifting toward joining this conflict. All right. One is the sinking of the Lusitania. This frequently gets kind of overstated as the sole cause why the U.S. joined the war, but we need to keep in mind there's a lot of other factors. Number one. Number two, there was quite some time between when this happened and when the U.S. actually joined the conflict, so no. But by the early years of World War One, Germany had been using their submarines to sink British Navy and merchant ships. Okay, merchant ships meaning ships engaging in trade, of course, non-military ships. And this was devastating for Britain because they're an island, all right? They're depending on ships coming in to bring them anything from food to clothing, everything they need has to come through a ship pretty much. And there was one particular British passenger liner, okay, again, a civilian ship just carrying passengers to Britain, but the Germans saw this ship heading to Britain. They said, well, they must be providing them some kind of support in some ways. And as it turned out, there were some guns and ammunition stored on this ship. And so Germany was not really off there, but they made the decision to sink this ship. And there were somewhere around 120 or so Americans on board, among about 1,200 people overall. And this was a very devastating loss to see this ship get destroyed, right? With all these civilian passengers on board being killed. And when Americans see other Americans get killed, they get pretty up in arms, right? It doesn't matter how many people have already died up to this point from the perspective of a lot of Americans, but the second one American dies, suddenly this is real, right? That's unfortunate, but it's a reality. And so once this happened, a lot of people began pushing for war, saying we need to go seek vengeance and declare war on Germany for their actions here against this ship that killed some American civilians here. By 1917, we'll carry another particular date. It's just there for reference. Germany took their submarine warfare pretty far and declared that they would be utilizing unrestricted submarine warfare, right? Meaning they were not concerned with whose ship was heading to an allied power nation. And they were not concerned what type of ship it was, whether it was a military ship or a civilian ship. Anybody's ships, any type of ship heading toward Britain or France was supplying them some form of support that would help them in some way during the war. So they were going to sink those ships. Any ships heading that way were potential to be sunk by German submarines. Again, there were some American ships sunk as a result of this. Furthermore, some people were just outraged at seeing civilian ships being sunk. Others were kind of frustrated with seeing Great Britain being cut off from supplies and basic things they needed, like food and clothing. And more people, as a result of this, continued to push for that call for war. Another major factor that got the U.S. drifting toward war was the Zimmermann telegram. This is an intercepted message sent from the German government to the Mexican government, in which the German government promised the Mexican government to help them with some things if they ended up joining their side of the conflict. Okay, so basically they said, if we end up going to war with the United States, we want you, Mexico, to be our ally. And if you are our ally, we will help you reclaim the territory you lost from the U.S., all right, during the Mexican-American War. Mexico kind of had their own troubles at the time. They were going through a revolution, not in a very strong state. Furthermore, they probably didn't have much interest in starting a conflict with the U.S. just because. But regardless, people were infuriated with the fact that the German government was even trying to incite the U.S.'s neighbors to go to war with them. And they started saying, we need to be proactive and stop these guys from doing things like this by declaring war on them. All right. Another major factor that kind of pushed the U.S. toward war was the Golden Rule. All right. And I'm not talking about the Golden Rule you learned in Sunday school. I'm talking about the real Golden Rule. He who has the gold makes the rule, right? And the U.S. had all kinds of money invested all around the world, but they had the majority of investments in allied power nations. So they kind of had an incentive to see allied power nations win this war so that they wouldn't lose those investments. Right. So a lot of them wanted to go protect their investments by backing up the allies in this war. And these investments were further threatened by another major factor pushing the U.S. to join the war, which was Russia gradually leaving the war as there was a revolution breaking out in Russia, right? This was a communist revolution against the czars, meaning the emperors of Russia. And as Russia was gradually pulling out of this war, we need to understand Russia is a very big, populous nation with a lot of people. Now all those troops are being pulled out of the war. That's a big loss for the Allied powers, right? And again, people concerned with all their investments in the Allied powers began saying, we need to kind of jump in there and fill that void and help protect our investments by backing up the Allies now that Russia's pulling out. This is more vital than ever. Final factor contributing to the U.S. being pushed toward joining the war was President Wilson himself. While he's sitting there saying that he kept the nation out of war and he'll be blessed among nations and all that jazz, he was kind of secretly making plans to have a seat at the negotiating table at the end of the war so that he could spread his influence and have some things go a certain way. All right. Basically, though, what he was wanting to do was use his position in government to sit down at this negotiating table after the war with all the major world leaders and fix the world. All right. So he wanted to basically look at problems that he perceived in the wider world and use his authority to fix those. Gee, that sounds like something we talked about before, doesn't it? That is progressivism in a nutshell, my friends. So basically, he wanted an opportunity to practice global progressivism by getting involved in World War I. All these pressures combined were a whole lot for the U.S. to handle, and they did eventually enter the war by April 1917. No big surprise that they joined on the side of the Allied powers. This war led to tremendous military growth that has continued ever since. And I don't carry all the specific numbers, but just to see what we're talking about here, by the start of the war, there were somewhere around 400,000 troops in the U.S. Army and National Guard. And by the end of the war, that number had jumped up to 4.8 million. Several million were drafted, others joined voluntarily, but there was tremendous military growth that would continue moving forward. All right, but we really need to think about what the combat experience was like for American soldiers in World War One. All right, as I suggested, I don't like getting caught up in battle tactics and strategies and details of battle too much. I like to focus more on causes, effects, and most importantly, human experience. All right, so let's see what this experience of this conflict was like for American soldiers. I'm going to go ahead and read a firsthand account here from a soldier who was fighting in the trenches during the Great War. One of the experiences that sticks out with the most prominence is that one of hearing my first shell exploding near us and knowing it was intended for us. Could hear it coming through the air and thought, sure, it had me, but it broke about 100 yards away in the deep woods. The whistling of the shell as it approached before it struck sounded like an express train approaching at top speed, then a tremendous explosion throwing branches into the air, for it had struck a tree. Later, we got to judge nearly the exact place that it would explode, but it was some time before this was realized. At first, the natural tendency is to bend forward, but later you overcome this to a certain degree, but there's always that natural inclination to bend the head forward. All the time we were in this position, Hun aeroplanes flew over us, and we used to watch them through the camouflage and hope they didn't spot us. One day we saw a German aeroplane brought down by one of our planes. We all stopped work and watched the battle. The German was ringed about with black puffs of exploding anti-aircraft shells and glistened like a star in the sunny rays. The American plane flew in the back of it, and we could hear the faint put of its machine guns in action. Finally, when it was quite some distance away, the German plane did a nosedive and burst into flames. No doubt a shell hit the gas tank. On the morning of September 12th at 1:15 a.m., we opened our first barrage on the enemy, and believe me, it was a wonder. I never knew that there were so many guns in the whole world as there were that we were hearing, and all going on at the same time. My gun fired an enormous amount of shells, for the empty casings made an awful heap in the rear of the gun where they had been thrown by the crew. Some of us tripped to our waists, as the rate of fire at first was 2 or 3 shells to the minute and consisted of 3 high exploding shells to 1 gas shell. We had been receiving heavy shells for the past week every night, and what with our digging all day and unloading shells at night, our time was well taken up. The rate that we sent over the barrage was not the rate of speed that we were supposed to fire, but we became excited and gave the Germans all we had to send. I'm sure we gave more gas shells than were ordered, for we all wanted our boys, when they were over the top, to have as little opposition as possible. And from what I heard, they didn't have hardly any at all. We were firing on and off till noon that day. All that we had to eat was coffee and some bread that we took in between different times we were at the guns. Talk about tired when it was over. We were all in. I never knew that the French had a lot of guns right near us. They were also going off at full blast at the time we were firing. Talk about the 4th of July celebrations? That's a picnic compared to the noise that we all made. The flares lit this entire skyline, and shells flying through the air sounded like ceaseless taps of drums. The whole sky was lit with the flashes of the shells exploding, and the roars of all the guns mixed with the explosions made us all deaf for some time. You couldn't tell which way the shells were going. We were all so busy we never had time to think that perhaps some of the noise was the sound of Germans sending shells at us. When we finally did halt, the battery divided with the guns occasions going forward and the wagon going to the rear. We then moved forward, and after a little ride on the road, turned off and into the fields. It was getting dark by now, and we did not enjoy the trip at all, with the darkness and not knowing where we were going. Here occurred my first close experience with dead men, and this is how it occurred. We had made frequent stops to allow the officers to find out where we were, and the halts we had all fallen out to rest. I saw a nice log in the darkness, and then made my way to it to sit on it and rest. Imagine my surprise to find the log to be soft, and on putting my hands down to investigate, I found that my hands touched a cold, clammy, dead man's face. I did not sit on the log for long, as you might imagine, when I found out what it was. October 5th. Woke up at 5, finished digging in and prepared to fire. The barrage started a little after 5 o'clock, just at daybreak.
It was a slow barrage, but it kept us busy enough for the few minutes we were firing and took our mind off our surroundings, which was a good thing. The field surrounding the brush where we were situated was literally covered with dead Americans and Germans. The brush was the only cover to be seen, and the bare hills stretched back for a mile. It was rolling country, and the poor infantry had to advance in the face of terrible machine gun fire from the brush where we were now located. Most of the men near us were from the 23 Infantry and must have lost a whole slew of men. We were firing on and off till 1 o'clock, and by this I mean that we would go no longer to get our guns cleaned up than the orders would come back to begin again. During a pause in the firing, as soon as we got a chance, we buried a dead American that was in the same place where the gun was located and interfered with the placing and positioning of the gun. He was lying with his face toward the brush and with his hands outstretched in front of him. Right across his chest and on his outstretched left arm were the wounds of at least 8 machine gun bullets, and on his right arm was a luminous wristwatch. This watch gleamed at us the night previous. We only had time to dig a small hole to put him in and stood a rifle at its head with his dog tag on it for the burial squad to identify the remains. October 8th, drizzling all night and also today. Not very good chow, so we're getting a touch of real warfare. Fired a barrage for the infantry from 6 o'clock until 9. We did not fire very fast, only about 2 shots per minute on and off till 9. The coffee which we were getting tasted good when you're all cold and damp. It was still dark when we started the barrage at 6 o'clock, and the rain didn't help any. As soon as we stopped firing, we all had to bail out our gun pit, as the rain all night had filled it nearly to the brim, and the man who puts the shells in the guns had to stand in the cold water over his shoe tops. The spat of the gun has sunk out of sight. Whenever we fired the gun, its recoil had shot the water into the air, and we were all covered with mud and water. The mud around the gun is also terrible, as the constant tramping of a number of men over the soft ground had made the mud deep all over and everywhere.
So just imagine this is a young man, probably around 18 years old. That's the majority of young men fighting in World War II were about 18, 19. There were a lot of young men who were younger and found ways to lie about their age to go and fight. There were young men about 16 or 17 in some cases in the battlefield, living through these kinds of experiences that were just described. But we got to keep in mind what we just heard there was a testimony of one American soldier. So that's one soldier from one nation. And we have nations from all over Europe and some other parts of the world getting involved in this conflict, facing those same types of experiences. So this was going to be a very devastating war for Americans as well as for people from around the world. Okay. A lot of these American soldiers living through those kinds of experiences, going through those days of being stuck in the rain and mud while you're being fired at and having to shoot a barrage of bullets at the speed of light to try to save the lives of your fellow men while there's planes exploding and going to get a rest after being up all freaking day fighting and digging and sitting down on what you think is a log and discovering it's a human body and then being surrounded by bodies and brush. You can only imagine the impacts this is going to have on all these young men involved psychologically. All right. And there's going to be quite a great deal of trauma that results from this, as well as um, impacts on their friends and family members who see changes within them as a result of this trauma and don't really understand what this change is all about. Okay. We really still largely misunderstand or the kind of impacts that trauma like this can have on people. But in this period, people were really unfamiliar with even the concept of something like PTSD. This was very transformative for the lives of so many Americans. All right. And again, this is just one nation we're looking at here. We got to keep in mind that this is a experience that young men from around the world were facing during these years. All right. So, as far as what the U.S. contributed to the war, I would suggest that the U.S. definitely did play a key role in World War One, though they joined late. And though they faced very few losses overall comparative to the amount of young men that the Europeans lost, they did play a huge role in impacting the outcome of the war. All right. So, for example, we got to keep in mind that when Russia began pulling out of the war as a result of the Russian Revolution,
the Allies kind of found themselves at a stalemate with the Germans, all right? So there was really no progress being made one way or the other. But when the US entered the war and kind of filled that void from where the Russians had been fighting, they helped turn the war in the Allies' powers' favor, all right? They kind of helped break that stalemate. So that's definitely a key success of the US in this war. Another major impact that the US brought into the war was the presence of Native American soldiers, all right? So several Native Americans did join this conflict for reasons that you guys saw, including returning in some cases to traditional warrior roots, in other cases, as a result largely of the propaganda being spread. In this period, we'll be seeing a bit more forward. Many of these people felt that the United States was under attack, and the United States, as part of the Americas, they saw as their traditional homeland, and therefore they wanted to defend their homeland. Others we saw this as an opportunity to prove their worthiness in a way to others within society and maybe try to earn some kind of equal standing in American society. And remember, they offered a very unique contribution to the war effort. Many of them used their languages as a type of war code. And they would continue this practice even into World War II. All right, there was especially some Navajos who would use the Navajo language. They were referred to as Navajo code talkers. And even after World War II, some Germans would say, "What was this one code you guys were always using? There was one code that some of your guys would use that we could never figure out." Well, it turns out that's because it wasn't really a code at all. It was actual Native American languages, all right, being used as code. Definitely tremendous impact to the war there. But I also want to look at how the war was impacting Americans at home. You can see that one way it was impacting a lot of Americans was by the federal government finding different ways to gain support from the public for this war. And by that, I mean both material support and just having their kind of morale behind the war. So one way in which they gained a good deal of material support was by encouraging rationing. Rationing refers to cutting back on how much of a certain type of product is used or consumed. So people would be called on to cut back on things like flour or rubber, so that these types of materials and ingredients could be instead be sent to bases around the nation and around the world to help support the American military during the war. This was heavily pushed through different channels of propaganda, and so especially pushed onto women through things like cookbooks. So when I was in grad school, I took a US pop culture class, and one book we had to read in that class was actually this book about cookbooks in American history. And I remember when I was reading over the syllabus at the beginning of the semester, I was about ready to kick my professor in the knee because alongside that class, I was taking one of the most difficult classes the history grad students have to take, historiography class, who was under a professor who was very intense. And so I was just really afraid that I was going to be drowning in that other class at some point in the semester. And in the meantime, have to make time to read this book about cookbooks. But as it turned out, it was a very fascinating book, actually. And it kind of demonstrates how through cookbooks, you can see a lot of stereotypes about a certain historical period. And you can also see expectations that are being placed on the American people, particularly women, reflected through these cookbooks. All right, cookbooks are in many cases used as cultural symbols and also in many cases used as means of propaganda, as they were here during World War I. You'll see cookbooks that had recipes that included less of certain types of ingredients that the federal government was wanting the public to cut down on. Another way that the federal government was getting material support from the public was through the sale of Liberty bonds. Liberty bonds were certificates that the American people could purchase, and the money that they used to purchase these was used to fund the war. So the public was quite literally funding the war. And these are basically loans that the federal government would pay back after a set amount of time. So after the war, people could go cash back in those Liberty bonds and get back the money that they paid for it, plus a little bit of interest. All right. So there was definitely some kind of incentive to purchase these. You're going to get more money back in the long run. This also was heavily pushed through state-sponsored propaganda. And that propaganda is another key way in which the federal government got both support in terms of morale and material support. The state propaganda was created and organized largely by the Committee on Public Information, or CPI. And that's what I really want you to understand about this organization.
If you Google it or type it into ChatGPT, you're going to find all kinds of other crap about it that I'm not really concerned with. What I want you to understand is that this was the organization responsible for creating large amounts of state-sponsored propaganda during World War I, right, helping gain public support for the war. They advocated support for doing things like buying Liberty bonds and rationing, but they also created all different forms of media to just kind of promote a sense of patriotism and support for the war in that way. This included things like books, posters, films, newspaper articles, music, all kinds of media promoting the war in different ways was created and sponsored by the CPI. We also need to consider the impacts of the war on immigration and nativism. So there were all kinds of restrictions placed on immigration during the war to try to keep certain groups of people out. There was also a lot of pressure for people of certain ethnicities, especially those linked to the Central Powers, to leave the United States. And those who stayed frequently faced a great deal of discrimination and nativism. And a lot of this you've already seen, right? You've seen actions taken against, say, for example, Germans and German Americans during World War I, and you're reading video quiz for this week. We need to understand, though, a lot of Germans demonstrated a sense of loyalty to the United States. Many of them did join the armed services to fight against, in some cases, their own home countries because their loyalty was more to the United States. Yet they were seen as some kind of other, some kind of enemy, right? And a lot of this was largely pushed through that state-sponsored propaganda. And you saw some of the actions taken against these people. They had to register as enemy aliens. There were cases where, unfortunately, there were mass killings of German dog breeds. There was mass destruction of German communities and of German cultural objects, such as beer steins, all right? There was also cultural appropriation of a lot of German foods, all right? So, for example, people refused to call sauerkraut. They called it Liberty cabbage. Hot dogs, all right, were Frankfurters. That is a German food. But now it's become the good old staple American food, what we eat at the ball game and eat on the 4th of July when we got our fireworks going off. And I think it's just hilarious that this great standard staple American food is actually something that was taken and rebranded from our enemies during World War I. So definitely very significant nativism, unfortunately, for people who were of nationalities of the Central Powers. Another tremendous impact that World War I had on the American public came through the Espionage and Sedition Acts. So you'll remember these acts forbade any kind of speech or writing against the war or against the American flag or the American government. And violations of this law could include very high fines or even jail time. And this led to the prosecution of somewhere around 2,000 Americans, such as Eugene Debs, the presidential candidate for the American Socialist Party. As you saw, he ran for president from jail and received a tremendous number of votes, demonstrating perhaps strong opposition to these laws. And this definitely led to a tremendous growth in the U.S. agencies such as the FBI. The FBI, or the Bureau as it was called in this period, which eventually became known as the FBI, tripled in size during World War I in order to enforce these acts. And you might be thinking, isn't this a violation of the First Amendment? People have the right of free speech per the First Amendment, right? So how can there be a federal law restricting that? And this was an argument that was made in a case called Schenck versus U.S. And in that case, Schenck versus U.S., the Supreme Court ruled that any speech that poses a clear or present danger is not protected by the First Amendment, all right? And they also suggested that any speech against the war or the U.S. government during wartime could be considered as something that posed a clear and present danger, right? Or even too much talking about the war could be considered a clear and present danger. If somebody says, for example, I'm so sad my son got stationed to Berlin, he's going next week. Well, that could potentially give information to the enemy to know there's some boys being shipped off from the U.S. to Berlin next week, right? And I understand this is quite a bit of a stretch to say that criticizing the war or speaking out against what the federal government is trying to push is a clear and present danger, but this is what the Supreme Court ruled, okay? This does set pretty strict restrictions on that right to free speech. This is a very controversial Supreme Court ruling for understandable reasons. World War I definitely also intensified the Great Migration. The Great Migration, remember, was the mass exodus of African American communities leaving the South and collectively going and settling in the North or out in the West. And this was impacted by World War I because, on one hand, there were new war industry jobs opening up throughout the war that were open to African Americans in other parts of the country. But furthermore, as working class men of other ethnicities were going off to fight in the war, that left a bunch of job openings in these new booming industrial jobs that have started kicking off during the Gilded Age that African Americans largely left the South to go and fill. Now, this did have some negative impacts long term, as a lot of these soldiers returned home. They didn't always take kindly to having communities of African Americans now settled in their hometowns, or definitely, in many cases, didn't take kindly to having African Americans taking on their former jobs. And this led to a great deal of racial violence. Okay. There were a lot of race riots that resulted from this great migration. But again, remember, we can also see that this is a way in which African Americans were expressing a sense of agency during the Jim Crow years by leaving the South and helping themselves find new opportunities elsewhere.
So Wilson had laid out this vision for what he wanted the world to look like after World War I, before the war came to an end. He called this his 14 points. All right. He laid out 14 points for how he wanted the post-war world war to look, with the US as a new global leader of a new global alliance that would exist after the war. So let's break down these 14 points. I'm not going to go one by one through each point, but we can see generally some of the key things here that they called for. So the first few points, 1 through 5, were just general principles for governing international conduct in the future. And these were all direct responses to things that led up to and contributed to the intensity of the Great War. So he called for things like freedom of the seas, no secret treaties, free trade reduction of colonies around the world. And again, we see these things playing out in the causes of World War I, right? So freedom of the seas, that had to do with things like Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare. Secret treaties were in many cases what founded the alliances of nations who wound up going to war with one another. Free trade, that's a response to not only embargoes and trade restrictions that were placed between different countries on one another during the war, but it's also in response to things like restriction of that trade from, once again, that unrestricted submarine warfare. Reductions of colonies around the world, well, this is a direct response to what this war was all about. It all started with imperialism. It's all these different nations around the world claiming territories, claiming colonies, and butting heads with one another of who's got control of what. So this is hoping to reduce some of that conflict moving forward. Next several points, 6 through 13, laid out some recommendations for adjusting post-war boundaries. And Wilson's overall goal here was for all peoples around the world to achieve a sense of self-determination, right? So what he's suggesting here is any territories that had been overtaken during the war should be able to recreate themselves as independent nations. Okay, so essentially saying that empires needed to give up some of their claims and allow more of a sense of independence and self-determination for peoples living in these conquered territories. Then his final point was to create a League of Nations to implement all these principles. What he imagined here was a kind of global commission of world leaders who could come together and try to negotiate problems that they recognized before they broke out into war. All right, they could come together and resolve disputes with one another in each other's presence and help try to come to some peaceful terms to avoid another large-scale conflict like we saw in the Great War. This 14 points we can see, though, is a very clear example of global progressivism, right? President Wilson is recognizing all these problems around the world, right? Things like restrictions on trade, things like vast imperialism and a lack of self-determination. And he's using his authority in government to try to address these problems that he sees around the world. Remember, that is progressivism. So we can see once again, 14 points are a clear example of global progressivism. That sounds very historically significant to me. I would write that down if I were a student. So remember that when the U.S. joined the war, it was at a stalemate, that after Russia had pulled out of the war during the revolution, the Allies and the Central Powers were really killing each other left and right, but not making much progress. But then when the U.S. joined the war, they helped break the stalemate and turn the war in the Allies' favor. Well, after some substantial victories, the Allies were able to kind of pressure the Central Powers to agree to an armistice, meaning a ceasefire. Got the date there, November 11th, 1918. I really don't care so much you note that. It's just there for reference. But after this armistice, agreements were made to set up a series of negotiations that would ultimately lead to the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Again, don't care you know the dates, there for reference. But the Treaty of Versailles would be the treaty that actually ended World War I. The negotiations behind this treaty would be the negotiations that ended the war. And as President Wilson hoped, he was present there at the peace talks as the Treaty of Versailles was being negotiated. And he was hoping to implement his 14 points into this treaty so that he could establish the U.S. as a global leader of this new world that he wanted to create after World War I. He really didn't have too much success with his plans to get Europe to agree to his 14 points. Now, they did jump on board with the League of Nations. They said, okay, yeah, that sounds pretty reasonable to have us have this commission of global leaders who can resolve things peacefully before we all go killing each other again. They said this was a very expensive war, also very costly in terms of lives. Sure, yeah, let's try to avoid this from happening again. Global Commission sounds like a great idea. All right. So they did agree to create the League of Nations. But most of his other plans were shot down. As I've suggested here, they were a bit whimsical. They were not really grounded in reality. So there was all kinds of problems with the 14 points in terms of no real method being spelled out for how some of these things would actually be carried out. Okay. So, for example, things like having all people around the world have this sense of self determination, that sounds nice and dandy, but we got to keep in mind that all these other countries have been fighting very hard for quite some time, have lost tens and thousands of lives from some of their countries, spent bukus of dollars on this conflict, and now they're just being told, oh, but you just got to give up everything you've claimed from this war. They're not going to be so quick to do that, right? And a lot of them are going to look at Wilson and say, look, dude, you can't just jump in this war at the last minute and come and start calling shots and telling us to give up everything we fought for. You got another thing coming. Another major issue with the 14 points that a lot of European nations had was that President Wilson was suggesting that there should be kind of a return to pre war boundaries, meaning that, again, territory should be given up and countries should agree to the same borders that they had before the war, essentially kind of letting bygones be bygones. And a lot of the victors of this war, once again, said, no, we fought very hard for what we've earned. And furthermore, they believed that countries like Germany, they saw as aggressors of this war, needed to be punished for the roles they played in this war. Okay. And they believed also that they needed to pay some kinds of reparations for the cost of this war. So overall, Wilson's plans were viewed as whimsical and not taken very seriously here in Europe. Now, this got even more complicated when it came time for him to sign on to the Treaty of Versailles, making the U.S. A member of the agreement here in the Treaty of Versailles. Because per the U.S. Constitution, a president alone cannot sign on to a treaty and have it mean anything. For the U.S. to sign on to a treaty, 2/3 of the American Senate has to ratify the treaty. And Wilson really struggled to gain enough support from the U.S. Senate. Now, there's a number of reasons why the Senate was hesitant to back him up on signing into this treaty, but I'm going to suggest that a major reason is the fact that during this year of 1919, when all this was being negotiated, the country was falling apart back in the U.S. All right, there's this fear of a radical foreign threat that was based on a legitimate, limited anarchist threat in the U.S. There were people mailing bombs to other people. There were bombs going off. There were these big raids being carried out against large numbers of people suspected of being radicals. There was a pandemic sweeping around the world, definitely prevalent in the United States. Hell, even the World Series was being rigged. All kinds of chaos and mayhem in the U.S. And then where's President Wilson? Why is he not doing anything about this? Well, because he's too busy over in France playing peacemaker, trying to sell this whimsical 14 points away to the countries in Europe instead of being in the U.S. dealing with all the problems that are plaguing the nation. With this and some other things in mind, the Senate kind of scoffed at Wilson and said, there is no way we are signing anything you ask us to right now. Get your ass home and come take care of things here.
So while President Wilson envisioned the U.S. as this grand leader of a global order, playing a key role in this League of Nations, he ended up not even being able to join the League of Nations, let alone getting the U.S. to sign on to the Treaty of Versailles. By contrast, the U.S. from here wound up retreating into a state of isolationism and getting less involved in global affairs for some time. Nice try, Wilson.